Okay. Okay, first I'd like to say thank you for making it to the final session. It's been an honor being here. I'd like to thank Mona and the organizers for asking me to present my dear friend's session, Amro Ali. I first met Amro 3 years ago. It was in one of the Save Alex protests. For those of you who aren't familiar, Save Alex is a initiative, that works on preserving architectural heritage. And from then on, we became friends. And he's also the founder of the Alexandria Group Scholars on Facebook, which I'm co-admin along with 3 other colleagues. In fact, today, one of our colleagues are present, Khulud on the front row. Khulud, raise your hands. Okay. Amro first became well-known after he published his piece on Khalid Said, who happens to be his neighbor, in 2012. He went on to publish a series of articles covering the Alexandria social movements, such as activism, street art, elite power plays, and more. One of my favorite articles is Son of Beaches, pun intended, which talks about how Alexandria's ideological battles help shape Egypt. He also writes for Mada Masr, Tahrir Institute for Middle East Policy, Guardian, Open Democracy, Atlantic Council, and more. Amro is also in his final year of his PhD, which he's doing in University of Sydney, Australia. His research examines Alexandria as a political laboratory in how a revolution is sustained in times of straight crackdowns and counter-revolution. He uses the framework of Hannah Arendt, among other authors, to understand the concept of beginnings and action in the context of Egypt's revolutionary trajectory. Amro, unlike myself and several others, are strong proponents, you would say, of decentralization to sort of pushing the Alexandrian civic narrative beyond the capital to sort of counter the heavy concentration on Cairo, if you will. We've decided that we were going to dedicate this session to the memory of Shaimat al-Sabbagh. And we've also decided that we're going to dedicate it to all the unknown political prisoners, freedom fighters, who we don't get to hear their story. So without further ado, I present to you Amro Ali.
Thank you, Magda. Thank you very much. That was very overwhelming. I have to warn you about Magda, though. She looks calm and collected and peaceful and all that, but she's quite well known on Alexandria streets for her revolutionary street cred. So if you ever bump into her on the streets, make sure you don't say the wrong thing, such as give the protest law a chance, or at least we're not Mesopotamia and Assyria. The outcome is rarely ever pretty. I would like to thank Mona, Yasmin, and Mada Masr for putting together this wonderful conference. It has been a great honor to be invited here to speak, and the conference has been a breakthrough and an array of visions and ideas, and I've learned so much from. And I never knew that there was so much complexities to the phenomenon of translation. But it does show you the power of language and the use and abuse of language and translation, and which is actually a staple of Egyptian history. In fact, on the eve of the 1952 coup, the free officers were gathered, and one of them started panicking and started tearing and was really worried that the plot will be foiled and they'll be arrested. And Nasser said to him, "There is no time for panicking. We must be on guard and be prepared for the unexpected." And the man calmed down, and when he gathered himself, he asked Nasser, "Why did you address me in English?" And Nasser laughed and replied, "Because Arabic is hardly a language to call for calm." But with the revolution, Ali sought. But I come from a political sociology background, and the way I understand translation is certainly linguistic, but also in this context, how a city is a form of representation in different languages and contexts. How a city translates itself into the local, national, and international platform. Alexandria is of personal and academic interest to me. What I often do is examine how Alexandrians react to events, the language that describes the city, the providential nationalism that shows up from time to time, the identity construction, and the changing notion of Alexandria to the state and to its own history. My awakening on this whole matter came about with the death of Khaled Said in June 2010, and apart from the fact that it was a brutal death and all that, but it was also how it was being narrated abroad. And when I say abroad, I just don't mean outside Egypt, but even to Cairo and that. And then I started to see the divergence and how popular culture and everything else has skewed the narratives that come out of Alexandria. Alexandria, from the start, is not an easy city to research. It's from within or about. Record keeping over the decades is almost non-existent. It's not one of its strengths. There is no institutional history or social history. So you often have to rely heavily on oral interviews. Oops.
No.
No.
Oh, there it is.
Okay, sure. The artist Taha Al-Karni painted this painting of revolutionary Alexandria in 2011, and it's a splendid image that captures the public freedom, public happiness, and public spirit of those 18 days. The city was no longer just free of the regime, but also free of the predefined constraints imposed on Alexandria. The burden of nostalgia and the political branding, which I will discuss soon. In the midst of the celebrations, there was a growing sense of alarm that Alexandria was being marginalized again. We have to remember what the world was like in Egypt in 2010, because in Alexandria it was quite extreme. You had the death of Khaled Said, you had the All Saints Church bombing at the end of that year, then you had the death of Bilal Said, and also the police repression was unprecedented, to the extent that the MB parliamentarian, or lawyer, shall I say, Subhi Salah said, it feels like we're under a foreign power. I wish they would just implement the emergency law. That would be great. The revolution was like a beginning or a second birth. The second birth, Hannah Arendt argues in The Human Condition and on revolution, can only occur when individuals enter the public sphere as citizens. Only then can equality and freedom appear. She further adds, it is in the very nature of beginning to carry with itself a measure of complete arbitrariness. Not only is it not bound into a reliable chain of cause and effect, a chain in which each effect immediately turns into the cause for future developments. The beginning has, as it were, nothing whatsoever to hold on to. It is as though it came out of nowhere in either time or space. In other words, humans come into this world as unique, distinct, and new individuals, a phenomenon that has never seen that individual exist before or will ever exist after. In the same manner, action creates unpredictable new combination in the world of politics. Action is closely related to natality because individuals, by acting in speech and deed, reenact the miracle of beginning that is inherent in their birth. So both birth and action can cause a breach and breakup of previously known and consistent patterns of cause and effect. That's why when someone says the revolution is dead, I want to ask what is dead about it. It's actually a process that has already stopped. It's irreversible. It's like going back in a time machine to 1793, 4 years after the French Revolution, and saying the French Revolution is dead. It's unfathomable. What is clear on the streets of Alexandria is that the revolution was also minimizing the effects, or shall I say, the Tahrir-centric narrative was minimizing all the other governorates and their stories. And to give you an example, and this is typical of Alexandrian insecurity, which they're very famous for. Bithynia Kamel was running for elections, for presidential elections, or she wanted to launch a bid in around April 2011. She came to Alexandria University and she said Alexandria started the revolution, and everyone stood up and applauded. When Shema al-Sabah was killed, on the Alexandrian internet, everyone was asking or saying, is she going to be buried in the capital? She should come back home, even though they didn't know her. So Alexandrians often measure themselves in relationship to other cities and countries in the world, basically. So providential nationalism plays a part, certainly. And what we've also seen is the centralization of the imaginary as well. So we've seen this obviously in the conference, but this is a byproduct of how we all think. And to look at one study, for example, looking at the Bassem Youssef show, for the year and a half it was televised, and no other governor was actually mentioned in that program except for Alexandria on 2 occasions, and that was when he was giving a shout out to Mehinur al-Masri, and when he was discussing when the movie a reference to Alexandria Why by Yusuf Shaheen. And this causes public anxiety, and there are 2 primary reasons it's actually that causes it. What I call the nostalgia Baltagaya, and I have to credit Gennaro, who actually came with that term. This is actually a very problematic issue for the city, where Alexandria is judged according to its history, either ancient or cosmopolitan. What we've seen over the past 2 decades has been a literature and a revival of cosmopolitan literature, very uncritical, that seeks to revive that past. And so you see this in billboards, the Alexandrian internet, the circulation of images, the return to monarchy discussions, the name of restaurants that have King Farouk motifs. And it seems to me it's a matter that torments the visitors more than the residents. I remember in the French embassy last year, a French consulate where they were having their National Day, and a newly arrived Western diplomat asked me, "Tell me in less than 10 words, how does one survive in Alexandria?" And I told him, "Never let nostalgia torment you nor overwhelm you." And it looks like he had a moment of epiphany just then. The other issue is politically branding Alexandria. Over the past 60 years, there have been different ways that the state has treated Alexandria to suit political, ideological, and economic agendas. And I'll be discussing more of that very soon. I don't know if you've read this article. It came out in December, The Lighthouse Dems and Foreign Policy. Did you read this, anyone? Yeah. I'm quoted in this article, and so is Magda, as Magda was the translator.
Unfortunately.
We all make mistakes. What happened in this article is that basically it falls back into the binary of cosmopolitanism versus Salafism, and he cites me as saying that I wanted a return to ancient Alexandria. That wasn't exactly what I said. But I don't think he was insincere, because he was, for that 3-hour interview at the restaurant called, appropriately enough, the Imperial, he was reading too much into it. And so, I often, alarm bells start ringing when someone mentions Lawrence Durrell and Gaddafi and et cetera, et cetera. I mean, these are great figures, don't get me wrong. But there was a certain context it was being mentioned in. He even says to me, he quotes me as saying, for example, where I say the current Egyptian president is no Ptolemy the First. I actually did say that, but it was actually a part of a broader discussion of comparing the Alexandrian trajectory. So the point I was pushing, for example, was that I wish for Alexandria's philosophical traditions that it's historically associated with to be revived and to take precedence over the security mindset in the public sphere. Somehow that became Cleopatra and ancient Alexandria to him and everything else. But I do believe the writer was sincere, because he's not an unusual one, despite the fact that it was a 3-hour interview. And this is really the curse of Alexandria, is that it exists in its own shadow. And if we look at the way it comes out in how the international news treats the city of Alexandria. These are the titles that news articles give it. Former cosmopolitan city. Once known as the Pearl of the Mediterranean, a city of faded grandeur, shadow of its former self, once glorious city. I mean, you can make the same cases for Cairo, but it won't happen. And that's because Alexandria exists in the imagination. It's a very powerful effect. The political descriptions that it's given, the Islamist bastion, that was That's still used. Revolutionary Alexandria was used for a while, especially after the revolution, Khaled Said, but especially after Hamdin Sabahi had won Alexandria. But I don't see it as much anymore, used that often. The other strange thing about the way the city is treated in the international press is that it's always given geographical qualifiers. For a city you think would sell itself. So Egypt's the second largest city, coastal city, northern city, port city, plays second fiddle to Cairo. You don't see this. You don't see the port city of Naples. You just see Naples. You don't see the northern city of Edinburgh. You just see Edinburgh. The same thing with coastal city of Boston. You can keep going on, but it just shows you how far it has fallen off the international radar. And then the other interesting trend that I often see in news reporting on Alexandria is placing unrelated historical references in an article that has nothing to do with the topic is about. So, for example, you could have an article that talks about a building collapse in Alexandria, and it'll say the city of Alexandria, the city of Cleopatra, for example. Or there could be Islamist violence, and then it makes a reference to the burning of the ancient library. Or, you're supposed to put the link together. The other problem is that modern Alexandria does not exist almost is non-existent in bookstores. It's very scarce, either in Arabic or in English, and it's still limited to cosmopolitanism, ancient Alexandria, and Greco-Roman discoveries. There have been advances in terms of novels, such as Ibrahim Abdel-Magid and Edward al-Kharat, but that generally is still minute. And the academic structure in Alexandria has an elite that controls who rises to the top, etc. They have a monopoly over research. So sharing and collaboration is a problematic and top-down. And PhD dissertations rarely make it to books and journal articles in that city. So what all this does is start skewing the indigenous narratives that could be coming out of the city that don't. The other issue of Alexandria's relationship to Egypt, and this leads to political branding and soft power, the Egyptian state has historically viewed Alexandria as the Trojan horse city, because this is the city where diseases come through, invasions, riots and revolutions often have their starting point there. Strangely enough, for a city that's often credited with being a trendsetter, little research goes into it, not for Alexandria's sake, but for what role it plays in the Egyptian state. There are explanations of why Alexandria is able to move the trajectory of Egyptian politics. One explanation is centralization and nurturing of an oppositional city. The other is positive connotations of beach, summer, escapism, and the popular arts. There's also more coherent but very skewed narratives that come out of Alexandria. It's a linear city, and with low transportation costs, so that enables a rapid movement of ideas and actors. And there's a stronger sense of city identity, so it's not unusual to see Nubians moving to Alexandria and adopting immediately the Alexandrian citizenship identity. And this makes it of interest to the Cairo elites and the security establishment. And just briefly, these are the periods that Alexandria is often divided into: the Second Golden Age, and then where there was a rough power-sharing arrangement between Cairo and the summer capital of Alexandria. There was relatively more freedom in Alexandria pre-1952 to criticize the regime, and it has been the trendsetter. It is the first feminist newspaper came out there, first film shot, first train station, first statue in the Muslim world, etc., etc. And the businessmen competed in the beautification of the public space more so than what came out of King Farouk's treasury. And we see in that period also the resurrection of the ancient cultural imaginary, where Muhammad Ali was compared to Alexander the Great, and the rise of museums in that era, and so forth. In the domain of contested cities, we also see Cairo hostility grows after 1882, where Alexandria gets that reputation as a Trojan horse city and becomes on the opposition end of the nationalist discourse. Ibn Khaldun once said, the life of a dynasty is the life of its city, and this is when we start to see the waning of Alexandria. Philip Mansell makes the case that there was after 1952, there was a contested city battle between Alexandria and Cairo, between the elites. To quote him, in 1952, Alexandria itself was deposed as well as the king. The coup expressed one of those hidden contests of cities which can drive events as much as class or international wars. In 1952, the coup was Cairo's revenge on Alexandria. The presence in Alexandria of the king and the ministers facilitated the success of the coup in Cairo. The tanks as well as the orders for the coup came from Cairo. So we see the ministers are made to return, and the idea of a summer capital was ended. And so the long road from 1882 came to a head, and Alexandria started to represent an oppositional struggle over the years. It would be, later on, it would be left-wing militancy, then Islamist struggles after the 70s. Then Alexandria's real problems begin there, because in an era of anti-colonial struggles and pan-Arabism, Alexandria did not have much to contribute because of its heritage and its association with Western Greco heritage. Also, cultural funding was diverted to Pharaonic and Arab heritage, where Greco-Roman missed out. And then the flight of foreign communities caused a severe disruption in Alexandria's urban fabric. So the political branding comes into full force, by now de-emphasizing whatever remained before and of its history, and emphasizing Arab history. Although no Alexandrian would deny their Arab heritage, but NASA just had to make sure. So these statues are still around today, and they were placed in the 1960s. And a committee was even set up to write a publication on the achievements of Alexandria under Arab rule. It's actually a well-researched publication, even if it's under the state, but it says a lot when the state has to drive such academic initiatives in the 60s. And so you have the Arab statues, and this Said Darwish, the Arabian music composer. And so we come to the era of Sadat's Alexandria. And Alexandria becomes indicative of Sadat's changing politics, moving from left to right and courting the West. And Sadat's relationship with Alexandria is quite a peculiar one, because when he made the radio announcement in 1952, announcing the coup at 7 a.m. in the morning, the first institute to support the coup was Alexandria University. They sent a telegraph saying we support it, etc. And that's why it endeared him. And there was jubilation through the free officer ranks. And he gave Alexandria the title, I don't know if he gave it or he revived it, the City of Struggle, ever since then. So the Nixon visit in 1974 was symbolic, and it represents a break from the past, and people cheered for a reason on Alexandria streets. Partly, yes, many were paid or encouraged or bribed, but also the fact that they saw the city back on the map. I don't think they really loved Nixon, but you know. And a month later, I think they cursed him, he resigned. But Alexandria experiences the full brunt of the Infitah, and given 80% of imports and exports came through these ports, it would make sense that the bread rights would also start there. Mubarak probably did the most for Alexandria, but he did it at a very high cost. The first symbolic visit was in 1984 to the Greco-Roman Museum. And that was a tradition that was revived since the King Farouk era, and that indicated the politics of Mubarak, because he knew, I don't think he knew, at least his advisors knew, that the Western world looks at Alexandria the way the Arab world looks at Cordoba in Spain. It fires up the imagination. Alexandria is the blueprint for Western civilization, and he wanted to milk it for all it's worth. So you start to see Hellenization of Alexandria in the 90s and 2000, and partly to counter Islamism as well. So there's to show another way of thinking. So there was a rise of Greco-Roman monuments and the Stanley Bridge, and the Bibliotheca Alexandrina was the crowning achievement. And also this was the period that coincided with the Greco-Roman discoveries, and elevated Mubarak's political legitimacy over Alexandria, or acquiring the Alexandria myth on the international stage. The privatization drive starts in the 1990s in Alexandria, and then there's a domino effect around the country after it starts there. And so Abdel Salam Mahgoub, made governor in 1997, struck an agreement with Alexandria's business community to beautify the public space, but this also turned out to be a privatization and the shrinking of the public space. There was no sense of community ownership when you see the plaques on bus shelters. So Alexandria was beautified but lost a lot of its beaches. And there was also this business concept called mirrors, where you beautify strategic parts of the Corniche, but it actually, if you walk a few meters into any area, it's very ugly. But it was actually done in a way so when a head of state or official visits, they're only taken on the corniche, taken to the library or San Stefano or whatever. And so this is why they'll report that Alexandria is so beautiful, etc., etc. But the anti-Mubarak streak had grown, and by the 2005 elections, the Alexandrians voted him out. Well, in whatever capacity that means. But also, there was a spread of monarchy mania, the films, billboards, restaurant names. In fact, a friend of mine, Rodwell Baruni, an academic at Alexandria University, although she's not there at the moment, said that one of the thinking in the elites of the 90s was to revive the Farouk era, King Farouk era, to make Alexandrians feel that elites are a good thing to have. That, look at how elites are. But what the public started doing is comparing how bad this one is compared to the old one. At least they saw cultural elites compared to parasitical elites. So these are marking points. What we see, Alexandria revolves through that era, and so through the past 60 years. Why I chose 67 is it's very significant. It coincides with the publication of Naguib Mahfouz's Miramar and the 1967 war. This was a coincidence, but it was very telling because Alexandria started to be seen as the redeemer, and it was very reflective in the novel of The Pension in Miramar, where there's a redemption and reconciliation and making peace with the past that comes across from the novel. The 84 one because of that visit as Redeemer that Mubarak chooses. Universalism are buzzwords that were taking place about Alexandria, with UNESCO choosing Alexandria for the Biblioteca project. So there were a lot of buzzwords thrown around in the 80s and 90s why Alexandria should be used as a model city. But this didn't mean anything. It didn't help the city. Like it didn't decentralize or anything. But all this was for international consumption. And also, finally, how much time is it? Okay. 15. Okay. And so, Alexandria's problems are also compounded by further matters, such as the lack of tourism that no longer go there, the brain drain that goes to the capital or outside Egypt, and it worsens the situation in the sense that there is no longer exposure to new ideas and people in Alexandria. So how do we reconcile or fix these problems? I'm going to show you various initiatives that we work on. Well, this one is what myself and Magda, Alexandria Scholars Facebook group, Khulud, Sarah Abdelghani, and Mohammed Nabil work on. Basically, it's to push a civic narrative, a very different narrative of what's happening in Alexandria, to push new voices, new musicians, new artists, everything that falls outside the traditional stereotype of Alexandria, although we engage in that as well, of course. And also reconstructing Alexandrian social history by the simple fact of posting new documents, new photos, anything that would add value to what really is a forgotten history. And also we engage in events on a monthly basis. Sometimes it doesn't happen, but when we do, it often tries to get a wide section of people. One thing I often that fascinates me is when I see engineering students come to the events and they come with us to an arts event or a theater play, and it's something that they've never experienced before, and the facial expression is phenomenal. But they're actually one. And the School of Medicine is one that are really deprived of the liberal arts. The other one, heritage preservation. Save Alexandria does another way of translating its message to the world. It gets writers, often the writers approach them, and they engaged in discussions, because they have realized, and many of us have realized, the only way you can get authorities to move in the city is by pushing the issue onto the international spotlight. That form of humiliation really starts to get them talking, especially if it's just an article in Open Democracy. The other one is cross-cultural cooperation. You have Mohammed Gohar's urban sketches. It documents the urban heritage of Alexandria and what's being lost in Alexandria. And he does this also, although it's his initiative, it's purely his initiative, but he does get foreign nationals to work on him, to cooperate and to have some exposures to the urban happenings around the city. The other project, and I have to use the internet for this. The other one is Alexandria Streets project. I will read you an interview that I had with Julia Tick and Berit Schuk, the two German nationals who launched this brilliant project. And it's an example of a map that tries to document the voices of different various of Alexandrians. So I'll just read you this. We would rather say the Alexandrian Streets project grew out of an urgency. When each of us visited Alexandria between 2008 and 2010, we both observed that the actual situation of Alexandria and Alexandrians had very little to do with the city's literary myth, and that a lot of stories were circulating among the people that reconnected people to places and vice versa, with an almost transformative effect on the city's identity. Starting from 2010, we therefore, both of them, Julia and Berit, met up with writers like Yusuf Zidane, the curator Bassem Al-Barouni, or the theatre maker Noura Amin, and they also dealt with Radio Tram. A musician Mohammed Hosni, social activists, residents in the popular neighborhoods in the east of Alexandria, began to collect stories that would allow to present Alexandria differently from the perspective of people who work and live there today. So I'll give you one clip, for example, and it's actually divided into past, present, and future. This one is Mahinur al-Masri, and I'll just give you, but there's various voices in this.
الشارع ده شكله هيبقى عامل ازاي كمان 10 سنين.
What this street will look like in the future.
لو الناس قدرت انها تقاوم اللي بيحصل في اسكندرية، الشارع ده هيبقى مبانيه زي ما هي بس بتتجدد بشكل افضل. اولا هيتغير اسمه بشكل حقيقي لشارع خالد سعيد، في يافطه محطوطه انه ده شارع خالد سعيد، بس ده مش بشكل رسمي. المنطقه دي هتبقى فيها شارع خالد سعيد، واتمنى انه يبقى فيها جداريات كبيره عليها صور كل الشهداء.
If people managed to save Alexandria, it will look better than now, with old buildings being renovated. The street will then officially be named Khaled Said Street. It is already done by people.
شارع خالد سعيد.
Khaled Said Street.
عملت ايه في حياتك؟ بلدك عملت لك ايه؟ مش ناوي تقول شويه من النوم اللي انت فيه؟ حرام نعيش حياتنا قبل نذل وهوان، حرام نعيش حياتنا.
Ever since.
الجرافيتي هو في الاول وفي الاخر مش حاجه، يعني مش حاجه سياحيه او حاجه اثريه او حاجه تاريخيه، هي حاجه في الاول وفي الاخر مرتبطه بالثوره. وعلشان كده السلطه نفسها كانت بتحارب الجرافيتي، بتحاول تمسحه طول الوقت. لانه انا بالنسبه لي كل ما بعدي مثلا هنا في كليوباترا وبشوف صوره خالد سعيد، انا بيتولد جوايا غضب ازيد بكتير. بفتكر اللحظات اللي احنا مرينا بيها، بيجي في دماغي صوره اطول شويه، يعني بيبتدي يجي في دماغي كل اللي الشرطه عذبتهم وماتوا، كل الناس اللي طلعت تهتف ضد تعذيب الشرطه، والبوليس كان بيقبض عليهم او بيضربهم او بيكردنهم بشكل او باخر. بيجي في دماغي الظلم. يعني انا بالنسبه لي المرتبط بالمدينه اكتر هيبقى عارف انه المنطقه دي المرسوم مثلا فيها الجرافيتي ده هي منطقه مرتبطه بنوع من انواع الظلم اللي كان واقع على اهالي المنطقه دي او على حتى الشعب ككل. فهو الموضوع مش بس ليه طابع فني جمالي.
Graffiti is not a touristic thing. Alexandrians understand every graffiti on the wall. When Mahinur walks in the street and sees the Khaled Said stencils, she remembers not only him, she remembers the police, the people who died. It is the whole story of the revolution.
هو ليه أكتر حاجة ليها دعوة باستمرار الثورة جوانا، إنه الثورة يعني طول ما في جرافيتي مرسوم بيطالب بمطالب ثورية بيفكرنا بأهداف الثورة، إحنا هنبقى بنقول للنظام ده إحنا عارفين كويس قوي إنك لسه ما سقطتش، إنه لسه في ظلم وإن إحنا هنكمل لغاية الآخر، إنه إحنا عمرنا ما هننسى شهدائنا، عمرنا ما هننسى مطالبنا وعمرنا ما هننسى احلامنا، وان احنا مكملين. فهو نوع من انواع يعني الوقود لينا اكتر منه انه حاجه فنيه. ممكن تبقى بالنسبه للناس مش من اهالي المدينه او ما مروش بالثوره او.
Okay, this was Mehnur, but obviously the others have the poets, the writer Ala Khalid, and the voices from Radio Trum, and it has a good representation of people's voices in the city, and many of them are unknown as well. If we scroll down, actually, it's quite ingenious. They have There is nothing to see. If anyone's familiar with Alexandria's history, Lawrence Durrell came back in 1977 to do a documentary, a BBC documentary, on the 20-year anniversary of the Alexandria Quartet. And when he walked the streets, he said there was nothing to see, and other negative stuff. So this is like a counter argument by bringing out all these voices that would have existed at the time, but he ignored. Also what we've seen as another form of translation is also the rise of Alexandrian street art. Interestingly enough, I was actually quite shocked when I saw a Roman centurion used by Alexandrian activists and artists at the bottom there. That doesn't mean they're associating with imperial measures or whatever, but they see that as an icon and they're acquiring it. Then also there was a rise. A lot of these, unfortunately, these graffiti have gone now. But a rise of placing Alexandria in relationship to either the world or to Egypt. So what you have in this mural, I think this is in Ibrahimiyya, where you have Alexandria. And this is one interpretation that I've been given, that Alexandria brings the peace to the war in Cairo. That they're meeting halfway to build up the future. But it's very pan-Arabist, given the flags that are above it. This one really fascinated me. This is the Tahdeya, these are the Alexandria Soccer Ultras, that they started using these iconography and graffiti and associating themselves with the Ptolemaic era. So they call themselves the Alexander grandsons, Alexander the Great's grandsons. They literally translated that from Arabic. And also what appears to be an army on the right side, some sort of Macedonian army or something. The other form of countering political branding is to literally counter it, and so it wasn't unusual to see during the Muhammad Mahmud clashes to put the eye patch on the Greco-Roman statues and to put a flag and to put the sign that says Gad'an khalaqat aini. You've removed a good one. You've removed my eye. The other, also since 2011, what I've seen is also proliferation of Alexandrian icons, and so we've seen Radio Tram adopts the tram. Iskandariya Mishmariya. This one is a environmental one, which means roughly translates as Alexandria is no longer mine. And so it looks at environmental destruction, such as rubbish and floods. It's run by our friends Marianne Tedhom and Rania Joseph. But what's interesting, when I asked them, where did you get the idea of a mermaid? They said, our colleagues in Cairo told us we should use this one. And so it wasn't so much an initiative, and it really says something about how this all works, and it says a lot about the power relationship and understanding of Alexandria. I don't think of mermaids when I think of Alexandria, but although the movie Splash is a great movie from the 80s. So that's one thing. So what we've seen in responding to political branding and the cosmopolitanism, what was the joke? Islamiyya, cosmopolitania. This is becoming like a cult in a way. Is how to counter that, and is to actually engage in it, acquire these symbols, and rewrite it so it fits the narrative of the people, the inhabitants of that city, and push it abroad. And this is what I've seen over the past 4 years. The other thing is the translation, as I said, it's not just the Alexandrians who are initiating. A lot of it comes from abroad. So I often see, institutionally, I see a lot of Germans involved in this translation phenomenon. Italians especially, but in an informal sense, either freelancing or journalists. They've taken this up very, it's almost spiritually to see an associated city revive. So I'm going to thank you for that, but I just want to say one thing. It is International Women's Day, and as as Magda brought up, we are commemorating this to Shema. Microphone, sorry. My apologies. And one of the, I never knew Shema personally, but we share a lot of friends who knew her personally, and until this day they're still in heartache. 40 days have just passed since her passing away. But what she did that was really great, and the legacy she left, is that she documented everything. She, on the popular culture, the dying traditions of the city and in the rural villages, she documented everything. And this is something that is really important and that we neglect, because Alexandria and Egypt, it is a space suspended between past and future. There really is no social history. There is no institutional history. I mean, people just don't have a clue of what has happened 10 years before that. I mean, people think the revolution was caused by the Brotherhood, and it's not unusual to meet people who think like that. So memorialization is also important, and it's not the end, but the continuation of a struggle. Because if we don't succeed, or whatever our definition of success is not, the next generation picks up from that. And that is why importantly that we document, write everything, and let history take care of the rest. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Amro. We're going to open the questions now. Just try to keep them brief so we can get as much as we can. So questions? First row.
Thanks, Amr. I'm going to keep this brief, but a couple of questions. And as a disclaimer, I speak from a Cairene perspective.
No, that's okay.
And sorry. And yes, in the collective unconscious, I suppose Alexandria is associated with some kind of if not nostalgia per se, but yeah, that dream of cosmopolitanism, the possibility of cohabitation, diversity, multiplicity, various layers, etc. I mean, why is that something that needs to be engaged with as a negativity and not vice versa? I mean, you speak about this in terms of nostalgia only, in terms of going back to the past only. Why is it something that those initiatives want to tackle from only a negative perspective? The other thing I wanted to ask you about is when you spoke about Alexandrians measuring themselves up or down against other Egyptians, and you yourself referred to Alexandria as a citizenship and identity. What's the source of that? Where does that come from, that Alexandria is a citizenship or an identity by itself?
I use that based on an interview I had with Ala Khalid. That it's a very loosely defined term. There was
the mic.
I use that based on an interview with Ala Khalid. It's a very loose term. I don't use that in any formal sense, but there is a concept that's always been historically associated with Alexandria as a space of citizens, that not racial, not born. So if you walk into the space, you'll become an Alexandrian. That's how it's understood. This is actually there's actually a term that was used in ancient times. In fact, the Roman Senate actually gave privileges to non-Egyptian citizens so they can dilute the power of the Alexandrian citizenship. So it's something that's played up. Now, this is just something that's imaginary. I don't go around thinking I'm an Alexandrian citizen. Yeah. Okay, sorry. Okay. Yeah. The other thing, the phenomenon I find, I mean, I'll tell you something. Hisham Salam at Jadaliyah once said that he finds of all the migrants who move to Cairo, the most problematic are the Alexandrians, because they can never let go of their roots, and they can never identify they always have to juxtaposition Alexandria with Cairo, or with Egypt. So the conversation often goes like this, I'm from Alexandria, but I've lived here. So it's Nubians and other Sa'idas, Falahin don't do this when they come here. And interestingly enough, when I look at the Nubian community, which I have an interest in Alexandria. The first generation identifies themselves with the new city. But there's very traditional. They love their roots and all that. But all that all-encompassing space that they perceive Alexandria to be. Yeah. I think the other question was. What about it was the? It's not negative. It's how it's used. Often, I mean, there are a lot of revisionist books. Khaled Fahmy and Hala Halim have written on this about that it's associated with racism and colonialism. I believe there is some argument to that, but I don't believe. I mean, I'm against what Nasser did in the 50s. He really, like, if the people, the Egyptians I interviewed today about that episode, they described the tears in their faces while they were leaving the building. This really disrupted the fabric. Cairo, it happened in Cairo as well, but it wasn't so bad because Cairo has strong institutions relative to Alexandria. You have the AUC. We don't have equivalents like that in Alexandria. So there was always some form of cosmopolitanism going on. That's why I say, the way I look at cosmopolitanism today in Alexandria, is the best thing that's ever happened to Alexandria is Assyrians who've come to Alexandria. They've helped break the homogeneous nature of the city by introducing not just the new cuisines and all that stuff, but the pleasant dialect in the air, the humility in the social spaces, I get boring. It gets boring looking at the same sort of person and hearing the same person every day. So this is really the best part of cosmopolitanism that's being revived, not the court system and all that stuff.
Next,
Yeah.
Over there.
Thank you very much, and I'm trying to look at Alexandria as an independent entity, or whether it has a specific clear-cut identity in light of some of the writers, for instance, E.M. Forrester in his book, Alexandria, A History and a Guide. He was delineating the boundaries of the city and speaking factually about it. At a time when Lawrence Durrell, a contemporary of, and probably a friend of Forrester, in his Alexandria Quartet, he depicted it very negatively as the hub of prostitution, of killing, of cheating, and even the weather was bad, nothing was good. And at the very beginning, at the front page of Alexandria Quartet, he said only the city is real, as if nothing else is real. Alexandria has, or had at the time, a very big absorptive capacity. It managed.
I'm sorry to interrupt. Please keep the mobile phone switched off. Thank you. Go on.
Okay. It combined different nationalities, different languages, and even some people described it as a Greek city on an Egyptian land. I want you to elaborate on the identity and the character of Alexandria right now and in the near future. What is your perception or perspective about it? Thank you.
Perspective of where it stands in relation to its history, or just the situation today?
Yes, history.
Okay, if you look at, the most obvious threat to its history, or to Alexandria, is the destruction of urban heritage. This is a big problem, and we're trying to save that. Often some people tell us, like, I thought you don't like Lawrence Durrell. I never said that. I just, the whole point is that the man was quite Orientalist and all that, but still he's a great writer. I can't deny that part. So we need to save the memory of even those writers, even if we did not see eye to eye to them. Even the colonial heritage needs to be saved. The other problem, Alexandria is experiencing what Cairo has experienced a long time ago. The flight of the upper middle class that are moving to these confines on the end, these like Alex West and these Beverly Hills type, what I call prisons, to be honest. And this is really dangerous because it's taking away the responsibility to the public space. And they're actually quite responsible for all the problems that are happening. There's actually an elite magazine that's come out in Alexandria. It's called it came out last year. It's called See Through. It's called See Through Our Point of View. If you really want to see how bad the situation is with the city's elites, read this magazine. It's in English, very bad English, and they have a Facebook page, See Through, THRU. So I'm very concerned about the city. I'm also recently, and just to show you how there is no consultation happening at all. Recently there was the gate that leads to Alexandria. It was a Greco-Roman gate that was built in 2004, I think, and now it looks like a toilet roll, or a rolling pin. Exhauster, yeah, it looks like an exhauster. And you're thinking, I mean, are we that bad? Or I mean, not we, but like there is no imagination, there is no respect. It's almost like someone saw something on a catalog and said, "Oh, let's do this." You know. In fact, there are statues made by the company Stanley, and another way of countering political branding is by defacing these statues. These statues are so ugly. These are Greco-Roman statues, by the way. They're so ugly I could not put them on the slides, just because I respect you a lot, you know. But it's just really problematic of the political imagination or lack of it that exists across Egypt too. There is a new governor now. Many are optimistic, besides the ones who find him attractive and all that. But if we move on beyond that conversation, believe me, it's a big conversation in Alexandria. If we move beyond that, you know, I mean, he's a hardened capitalist. That's fine. I mean, he's not a military officer. I just want to see his policies. I don't know what he's going to do. I don't know how much power he has, because the problem with the governor is not with the governor; it's with the governorate. And it's the issue of centralization, because when the Alexandria government makes a decision and has to send it to Cairo, by the time it gets approval and comes back, the problem has gotten so bad that the budget allocated or whatever has been allocated is no longer appropriate enough. So I just have to say, you know, we just have to keep pushing on every day, and you know, and I'm optimistic, by the way. I have to be.
Okay, next, over there.
Thank you for your talk. So you were saying earlier that Alexandria became the governorate model of the free market economy. Yeah. And so I just wanted you to elaborate on that and where you also sort of mark that as happening, the starting point. Yeah.
It would definitely be 1997 when Mahgoub was put as governor. What happened in Alexandria is not unusual to the rest of the world, because in the neoliberal age, port cities became in vogue again. It was flexible for neoliberal trade, and we see the same thing in Morocco as well. With 10 years, it becomes revitalized and done up. It's not happening in Casablanca or in Rabat. It's happening in 10 years. 10 years, I don't know how to pronounce. Sorry. That was so. And Alexandria often is seen as a political laboratory. Historically and economically, you usually start something there, and if it kicks off, you take it to Cairo. So the first film industry started in Alexandria, but it didn't stay there. It moved on to Cairo because the market is bigger. It makes sense to move here. And so Alexandria, what you saw, the key, I would say, privatization. The best example and the earliest one would be the rubbish industry. That was privatized, and when that worked, however they define as worked, all the other governorates started copying the same idea of privatizing the rubbish industry. But Alexandria just became this, because you have more public spaces in Cairo than you do in Alexandria. It's only the corniche that you really have, and when you take that away, you really, suffocate the public space. I'll give you an example. Khaled Said, when he was a teenager, he used to like flying kites on the beach. Years had passed, and the beach that he liked to go to was no longer there. But he was an example of a lot of people who start to withdraw into themselves, go into do drugs or religious extremism. I remember the only place, and this is in the late 90s, when the Smuha, in the suburb of Smuha, there was a mall that was being built called Zahran Mall. It was still, it had been built, but that area was still being developed. But there were a lot of areas that the youth can go to, like very shady areas and very like open music events. But this was not permanent. But the fact of the matter is that they have to seek out sites that are still under construction to be able to have a normal social life or whatever, away from the eyes of their parents and all that. Yeah. So.
Okay, are there any more questions? No? Okay. Then I think I have to thank Amro, and we'll wrap it up, and I give it to you, Mona, for the closing address. Oh, Yasmin then. Okay, Yasmin al-Rafai.
Big round of applause to Mona and Yasmin and Madam Asr.
Okay, so, hi. Don't worry, I'm not going to keep us here for much longer. I know we're all eager to sort of leave this room and go out into the night. But I just feel like I want to say something about the significance of having a conference like this in Cairo now, a conference about language and translation and dissidence. Because of the crackdown, many groups and collectives that had formed, whether formally or spontaneously or in reaction to something or in a state of emergency, found themselves at different points having to disband, whether suddenly or sort of slowly, having to withdraw and stop their activities. And more than that, there's been a diminishing of the kind of spaces where people could come together and discuss the events that had happened, the events that were happening around us. And all this has led to a state of sort of atomization, I think, and Sameh at the opening of this conference had talked about the collective trauma of the Egyptian revolution and its aftermath or continuation, however you want to speak of it. And a part of that collective trauma is actually that maybe doesn't get much discussion is how it's experienced in isolation a lot of the time because of this lack of space. And the conference in the last few days before I talk about what the conference has made me think of directly, I think it's important to also acknowledge, and this ties into what Shireen Sekhali was talking about in referencing the limitations of this, the idea of nahda and awakening in looking at events in the region and how it sort of tends to imply that the rest of the time we're asleep, which is far from the case, because even if there's been an atomization and a wiping out of collective action in some ways, that is not an absolute, and people, whether as individuals or as ongoing groups, have continued to sort of translate their experiences of the last few years into new projects, be they art, literature, film, the incredible projects that human rights workers and organizations continue to put forward in Egypt under these very strangled circumstances. So it's important to remember that we are by no means asleep. And also the conference has made me think a lot about the way that we as people who have experienced, who reflect on or think about or write about the events of the last few years and ongoing events, how we talk to each other. So not how we talk to the world at large or the public or what we write on our blogs or in articles, but how we actually communicate with one another. And I found myself surprised when I was on the journalism panel on the first day, and I was surprised by the difficulty that I had in using the word coup to refer to what had happened in 2013, to actually say it out loud in a microphone at a conference in Egypt, and I thought about how different that would have been somewhere else, and it really surprised me because a lot of times we maybe focus on dealing with fear and constraint when it comes to straightforward political activity or political expression. But there's an equally important and equally dangerous constraint that we suffer in our internal communications and our communications amongst one another. So in that light, it's been very refreshing and very enlivening and extremely thought-provoking to work on this conference and be a part of it and see it actually come to life. And so on that note, I'll go on to my several thanks that I want to make. First of all, thanks to you guys for coming and for putting in your thought and your effort and your writing and your speaking abilities to making this such a rich 3 days. And thank you to the staff here at Robert who've been incredible at facilitating all of this logistically. And please give a round of applause to Dina Kafefi, who's sort of silently sitting in the back there. Dina has been almost single-handedly in charge of all of the logistics to do with this conference and has done an incredible job despite falling, unfortunately, quite ill at the inauguration of this. So thank you. And finally, of course, to the interpreters for doing an amazing job, and one crucial to the spirit of the conference. And yeah, thank you. And finally, and by way of bringing you up here, thank you to Mona for the concept, for bringing me on board, for being incredible.
Just a very, very brief word. Yasmin has done all the thanks, so I don't need to repeat them. But the remit of this conference and of the whole research project that I'm working on, the official remit, has been to draw attention to the political import of translation, narrowly conceived, and the way in which all the protest movements, including the revolution in Egypt, are heavily, heavily mediated by various types of translational acts. Although at one level, the point was to draw attention to this, and I'm glad that I think people are beginning to engage with it. At another level, as we were getting close to the conference and the political landscape in Egypt was changing quite radically, I was very, very grateful for the fact that most people think of translation in that stupid, limited way. And that the authorities probably thought, a conference on translation really can't possibly do much harm. And that kind of was our saving grace, as it were, because I heard from various people that the last 2 or 3 days before the conference started, so the largest number of registrations, and I was thinking, are people mad? They're leaving it to the very last minute to register. And I heard from various people that they didn't really think it was going to happen. It can't happen at this moment in time in Egypt. It happened partly because of that stupid idea of translation being a silly little technical thing that can't possibly do much harm, but very, very largely because of the efforts of Dina and Townhouse, for which I'm very, very grateful, the amount of negotiation of the political situation that went on in the background, and I can't pretend to get my head around the various things that were done and why they were done and how that negotiation proceeded, including I mentioned that already, but a lot of people weren't there, the very obvious mistranslation of the title of the conference for very, very, very real pragmatic reasons. All that was really with the advice and huge interventions on the part of Townhouse and Dina, so it only happened because of that, and I'm very grateful. Just to remind you, because some of you weren't there at the beginning, that the videos that have been taken of all the plenaries and the workshop will be available on the website. You all know the conference website. As soon as we can make it, but hopefully not later than a couple of weeks or so. Also, a copy of the program, if you didn't manage to get a copy because the numbers exceeded our expectations and we didn't obviously print enough programs, a copy of the program will be downloadable from the website. So thank you, and I hope that we will have other ways. I know that this has been an important event for connecting. We can't keep repeating the same types of platforms. We have to think of new types of platforms in future. And so I hope that, not necessarily another conference in Egypt, in Town House, but I hope we can think of other ways in which we can keep that conversation going, whether in Egypt or elsewhere, preferably in Egypt, because not everybody can travel to Berlin or London or whatever, so we have to think of new ways of doing it. And thank you.